Welcome to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. I'm Pastor Chris Miller. The world is unsettled, but that doesn't mean you have to be. This podcast is for people who want to walk calmly and confidently with Jesus in uncertain times. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to do. You make your own decisions. My aim is simple: to help you walk with Christ in a way that cultivates Christ-like character through clear thinking, intentional living, and confidence formed by conviction. We'll talk about scripture, culture, faith, and everyday obedience. And together, we'll learn to walk faithfully with Jesus day in and day out. We're walking this road together, faithful, grounded, and free. Hello and welcome. Thanks for taking the time to listen today. I always appreciate it when you guys listen in. Gives me a reason to do this. I hope you find the podcast helpful. Doing a bit of a rebrand on the podcast to give it a little wider appeal. PC speaking is probably not very interesting to anyone who doesn't know me, PC. Anyway, last week we started talking about tension on the podcast and working from the premise there are certain things that God holds in tension that people can't resolve. And we sometimes make the mistake of viewing that tension that is unresolvable as a problem to solve. And when we do that, we often associate the tension with a person because that's often where we feel tension. And if we treat them like a problem to solve or treat the tension like a problem to solve, we see the person as a problem. What we end up doing is fracturing the relationship because it's a tension that can't be resolved. And God holds some things in tension like that. And there are reasons he does so. And we're kind of looking into that as we talk about tension for a few weeks. I have 4 pictures on the wall in my office, and they tell a bit of a story. Each one is kind of odd, I suppose. If you're looking at them, haven't seen them before, you'd wonder what they mean. They don't make any sense at all until you actually look at them. And this week, we are looking at the picture of the guy who looks like a special forces operator. And there's a flock of sheep in front of him and some wolves up on the ridgeline above that. If you look at the little logo for the podcast, you'll see that. Um, and if you can't see it, I guess you just have to imagine it, which I'm sure you can do. But you look at that guy, he's got an M4, and somebody's probably wondering why is a shepherd carrying an M4? And I've thought about that sometimes. What if David had had an M4 when he fought Goliath? The story probably wouldn't be near as interesting. Although a sling is a pretty serious weapon if you're accurate with it. I've seen some YouTube videos and things like that where guys are using slings and they are really dangerous in the hands of a right person. I tried making them when I was a kid, but could never learn to be accurate. Could sling the rock fast, but just not where I wanted it to go. I'm looking at these pictures on my office wall right now, and I'm still deciding which one of these pictures is my favorite. But the one we're talking about today, I think, might be inching ahead just a little bit. And those wolves up on the ridge are about to rethink their life choices. And I also like that picture because it's personal to me. Long ago, I was part of an anti-terrorist military unit. And when I joined the military, I was fortunate or unfortunate, I guess, depending on how you look at it, to go through an extended period of training before I landed in my unit. And each school I went to became a bit more advanced and specialized than the one before it. I was about to graduate from my last training school when we were in a class one day, and 2 higher ups from the unit I would eventually join came and asked for, I think it was 12 volunteers or something like that, to fill out a team headed to Iraq during the first Gulf War. A few other fellas and I put our hands up and we went through an interview, selection, in-doc process, whatever you want to call it. And a few of us ended up becoming part of this unit. And I'm still in regular contact with some of those guys today. And I didn't put my hand up that day because I was feeling heroic. The reason I did it was because I knew that the rest of the group I was with at the time was likely going to be placed aboard ship long term. And that's not something I wanted to do. I wasn't interested in being on a ship long term. And I grew up in the desert and thought that sounded better than being on a ship. And that was almost 35 years ago now. And that particular unit was created specifically to detect, deter, and prevent terrorism. And the guy in the picture on my wall, he's a bit more technologically advanced than we were at the time. And, technology marches on, but the concept, idea, and purpose would still be pretty much the same. We did a lot of specialized training, and we used some cool equipment that a lot of people didn't get to use. And we usually had one team that was a react force, depending on what we were doing at the time and what was going on in the world. But what that meant was that if you were on the react team, your gear was staged on pallets in a hangar on an airstrip somewhere, and we were prepared to go anywhere in the world on short notice. And while we were on recall, we had to carry a beeper with us, which at the time was pretty high speed. It was pretty cool. A beeper was the peak of wireless technology, I suppose, back then. And when you were out and about as a young military guy and with a beeper on your belt, that got you the good kind of attention, I guess you could say. Whenever we went on a mission, we had formal rules of engagement. They were very specific about the escalation of force and what was not a target, very detailed and specific. And the situation determined the rules of engagement. We often worked around things that, if destroyed or damaged, would have led to pretty disastrous consequences. So we had to be very careful and surgical about what we did. And there were some situations where we were in that you know, the, any kind of engagement was a very much a last resort. But within those rules of engagement, within those boundaries, we had a lot of authority. You could almost say we had absolute authority. So when we were actually working, we had a lot of authority within the boundaries we were given, but we were ultimately still servants under someone else's authority. And when I was a team leader, my guys were under my authority, but I was under the authority of the men over me. There was always a chain of command. The military doesn't work without that, obviously, but there was often tension in that chain of command, tension with each other, with the chain of command, and sometimes there was tension with just simply trying to stay awake. And I don't know if they still do it, but there was one chain of command or authority that we all recognized, we were all subject to, and it never changed. It was the same for everyone, regardless of rank, mission, didn't change. It were the things we ultimately served. And the lowest one on the list was the Corps. We were all servants of the Corps, the branch of the military. And the next one above that was the country. We all served the country before the Corps. And the ultimate authority we served was God. And we actually said that God, country, and core, meaning I give my life to serve, even to the point of death. God first, then country, then core. And in the picture on my wall, the guy's a shepherd. He has authority, and he's about to exercise that authority on the wolves on the ridge line as a servant of the sheep. He has authority over both the sheep and the wolves, but he exercises that authority in a totally different way, depending on who he's exercising it with. As we talked about last week, there are things God holds in tension that we as people can't resolve. There's tensions that will never go away. And what we're doing is learning to be comfortable in that tension, not to panic, not to react, not to run, not to freak out, but just be calm, cool, and collected, not to rush, but just be patient. If that tension is misunderstood or viewed as a problem to be solved instead of a tension to be managed, bad things often come from that because people do overreact or panic. But when that tension is understood and managed well, the tension becomes a blessing. And today we're talking about the tension between authority and servanthood. I'm going to put a little bit of a disclaimer on this. I've thought about whether or not I should say this, but it's kind of fun to talk about. We all have biases and opinions, and I have many strong ones. I'm sure you do as well. My upbringing, values, morals, generational culture, cultural formation, all of that stuff have created in me what most people would probably consider an extreme view of authority. And I thought through this week as I was studying, and since we're talking about the tension between servanthood and authority, I thought, I'm going to put a disclaimer on this and tell you about how I personally view authority and how I feel about it. I generally don't question or push back against authority. I just simply ignore it. And the reason I don't spend time questioning authority is that I think, again, this is just my view and how I feel. And I'm not saying I'm right. It's just something that's kind of been formed in me. But I think that 98% of the time, authority tends to be incompetent, fearful, selfish, bureaucratic, top heavy, inefficient, wants to control you and take what you have. And if I were starting my own country, the Constitution would be 4 words long: don't be an idiot. And we'd work from there. But with that said, even I believe there is still a percentage, maybe 2% of authority, who gets it right, who does a really good job. We when we think of authority, we think of police and no, not so much police. I tend to think police do a pretty good job, but political authority is more in my mind when I think of authority. And I do know a couple of politicians personally, and they do a really good job. They really do care about their community. But we've all got our opinions about all of that stuff. And I'm trying not to let bias and opinion color my exposition of what we're talking about today. And I just thought it was fair to let you know up front. So if I say something that sounds extreme, just put it through that filter. And I strongly believe that the model of right authority is found in Jesus. I really do believe that. And you can see that all through the Gospels when you read about how Jesus interacted with people. Both authority and servanthood are very often misunderstood. Both words carry negative connotations for some. Like me and authority, I generally think of authority in a negative way. And the words themselves tend to carry some tension. I think a large part of that tension comes from the secular misunderstanding of biblical leadership and authority. And that misunderstanding is the result of sometimes incompetence, maybe fear, maybe even abuse of authority, which sometimes happens. That happens in church. That happens anywhere there's authority. Sometimes churches get an unfair share of critique when it comes to things like that. When the reality is that it's everywhere. But authority can be abused and has been abused. But abused authority is not biblical authority. That's authoritarianism. Servanthood can also be and has been misunderstood and abused, likely as a result of authoritarianism. And people have a negative view of it. And today, I hope to give you a biblical frame of authority and servanthood, some secular contrast, boundaries, and lastly, the application for authority and servanthood. In Mark chapter 10, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, go to Jesus and say, Jesus, we want you to do something for us. And remember, at the time, they still don't understand why Jesus had come. They still think that he's going to kick the Romans out of their homeland and set up his own kingdom, and he will be kingdom of that, or king of that kingdom. And James and John come to Jesus and say, hey, we want you to do something for us. And Jesus says, what can I do for you, fellows? Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing a bit. And they say, when you come into your glory, we want to sit on your right and your left hand. They're thinking that once you're king of Israel, we want to sit by you on your throne. They're thinking along the lines of political power. What they're asking for is to be second in command. And Jesus answers that with, you guys don't know what you're asking for. He says, can you drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they say, yes, we can. They don't understand. He's talking about the cross. They think he's talking about political power. The other disciples hear what James and John are asking for. And as you would guess, it causes some tension among them because they're thinking, hey, these guys are going to be over us. And they're angry with James and John, probably because they asked first for what they had hoped for. But they're arguing from a mindset that if you have authority, people serve you, they serve your purpose. And if you are a servant, you serve the purpose of the one in authority. We're going to read from Mark chapter 10, and we're going to read verses 42 through 45. And this is what they say. But Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are appointed to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever among you would be greatest must be servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." In this passage, we see Jesus define secular authority, model right authority, and he also describes servanthood and gives himself as an example. And the first thing Jesus does that models right authority is he intentionally steps into and interrupts and corrects the tension between the disciples. It's important to note that Jesus steps into that. He demonstrates what is often a contrast between the exercise of secular and biblical authority. A good leader steps into tension and moves towards people. Jesus doesn't scold the disciples from a distance. He didn't send the disciples a passive aggressive email or text message with a copy of a wordy bureaucratic policy document that no one's going to read. He gathers them together and he speaks to them directly. He's relational in his authority, not simply positional. And the first thing he says is, "You know," which is interesting. He starts by telling them what's obvious, observable, what's culturally normal for them, what they see around them. The disciples currently view authority as positional. They think that's the way the world works, and they're generally correct. It really is positional. The Roman Empire had authority in Judea, but it wasn't relational, it was positional. The Roman Empire had imposed itself as the authority over Israel. And the disciples didn't mind the idea of positional authority. They just wanted to be in that position themselves. And that's, I suppose, the way a lot of people view authority. We don't really mind the idea. We just like to have the authority ourselves. So in their world, they view authority as positional. And Jesus starts with where they are, not where they should be. Another good lesson there about, biblical authority, correct authority. Start with where people are, not with where they should be. And he begins by speaking about shared reality, but demonstrates divine contrast. He explains what they already understand, a pagan religious system or a pagan political system. They're like, they get that, they see that, they're annoyed by it. And in their experience, authority is granted by the emperor or the local governor, and then it's imposed or enforced by the military. They understand authority and leadership is imposed rather than entrusted. Jesus is not critiquing authority. He's critiquing the cultural view of authority. Then he gets to the heart of the problem. Jesus says they take that positional authority and they lord it over them. That means they use that authority, the power that comes with it, to serve themselves. The one with authority exists up above everyone else, and then he imposes his positional authority on everyone who's below him to serve him. And even in this critique, authority itself is not the problem. Authority must exist. Authority will exist. It always has. It always will. And I sometimes hear groups say, "Oh, we don't need a leader or authority figure. We'll just work things out together and everything will be great." That sounds nice, but it will not happen. It does not work like communism or socialism. It just doesn't work. And the thing about it is that someone will have authority and they'll probably end up with too much authority. Someone will be the leader in any group because authority always gravitates somewhere. And if it's not made clear who has authority and how that authority is used, you're pretty much rolling the dice and it could end up anywhere and it might be a negative thing. I remember a few years back, I received a phone call one night. On the other end of that call was a guy who was screaming at me and he was shouting in the phone and he told me I was a cruel dictator, which it was over a decision where I had exercised authority as a pastor, and it's a decision I had made that didn't even involve this person. I was well within my boundaries to make the decision. But if you're a conscientious person at all and someone shouts at you and tells you that you are a cruel dictator, that kind of takes you off guard. And you think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I am, and I just don't see it. And I thought about that for a while and prayed about it for a long time. And in time, I began to realize that what they said just wasn't true. I wasn't a cruel dictator. And I also thought about who would say something like that to the shepherd. And I thought, who'd say something like that to the shepherd? A wolf would say that the shepherd is a cruel dictator because he won't let the wolf have the sheep. And, authority is not the problem in this passage. Authoritarianism is. And a wolf in this picture would be an authoritarian. And the wolf lacks responsibility and love for the sheep. The wolf was self serving. They want to impose themselves on the sheep for their own benefit. They take without giving and they hurt the sheep. Then Jesus goes on to say, their great ones exercise authority over them. And that's kind of like a wolf imposing itself on the sheep for its own benefit. A wolf is greater than the sheep in every physical way. They've got teeth, they can run faster, they're bigger, they're stronger, they have the power. Kind of like during the time passage was taking place. The Roman Empire had power. They had the military there to enforce their will on people. And so the first thing Jesus does is name the authority for that the disciples already see. And then he holds a mirror up to it so he can contrast it with kingdom authority. Now, there is sometimes confusion about this passage and kind of, what would you say, more progressive Christianity tends to go this way with this passage, like Jesus came to cast off authoritarianism. That's not really true. And you're going to see what I'm talking about. He says in verses 43 through 45, but it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever among you would be greatest who would be greatest must be servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus says, but it shall not be so among you. And this is kind of where I'm talking about, where people tend to get things wrong. Jesus is not suggesting a better version of cultural authority or secular authority, a government authority. As Christians, they're called to submit to the secular authorities, live in peace as best you can under, secular government, which is what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to overthrow it, although we voice our opinions, we vote, we act within the system within which we live to the best of our ability to benefit everyone. But what Jesus is doing here, he's not suggesting a better version of cultural authority or, overtaking secular authority, nothing like that. But that's sometimes how we view biblical authority. We view it as a better version of secular authority. It's like, okay, well, we're going to take over the system and we're just going to be better or nicer. But that's not this at all. What Jesus is doing here is he's making a clean break from the cultural and secular view of authority, because that's always going to exist. It's always going to be there. What he does is he draws a clear boundary between the world and his people. And he does that in many ways throughout the Gospels. In this passage, he is specifically doing it around authority and servanthood. He isn't suggesting doing the same thing better. This is something entirely different. So much as we're able, let's set aside our own definition of authority and open our minds to what Jesus has to say, realizing that this isn't a better version of secular authority. This isn't worldly authority being redeemed. This is a different species. It's something else entirely. And Jesus says, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And Jesus does not abolish authority. He doesn't do away with greatness either in secular ways or spiritual ways. What he does is he redefines it so we understand what it's like serving him in his kingdom. Whereas the world defines greatness and authority by visibility, power, a title, or influence, greatness in God's kingdom is defined by proximity to need. Greatness is defined by servanthood. And the word servant implies willing, active, and embodied service, not passive humility or vague kindness or a different version of secular authority. Greatness in God's kingdom is hands on, costly, and mostly unnoticed work. If you want to be great in God's kingdom, you don't place yourself above people, you move towards people and among them. Then Jesus adds, whoever among you would be greatest must be the servant of all. Jesus says to be great in his kingdom, you must be a servant. And the greatest among those servants are those who are the servants of all, even the people they don't like. And that means not being selective in service, no favorites, not strategic kindness. In what he says, Jesus dismantles any attempt to curate service for reputation or personal gain, personal benefit. That's all goes out the window. The greatest in his kingdom is the servant motivated simply to serve everyone with nothing to gain. That's not an easy thing to do. That's hard for us to do. In verse 45, Jesus grounds servanthood and authority in himself. He says, for even the Son of Man, Jesus doesn't lead or exercise authority by theory, by principle, by idealism. He leads by embodying what servanthood and authority look like in his kingdom. Jesus came from heaven to us to live among us. He moved towards us, all powerful and perfect. Even Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And he's talking about something more than, being helpful occasionally, which is nice. He's talking about a life lived for the sake of others, a life lived in the service of others. Jesus doesn't ask his followers to do something that he wasn't willing to do himself. And that's another contrast between the secular and biblical ideas of authority and servanthood. Jesus asks people to follow him where he's already been. You go and do with him what he's already doing. When you're the newest person on the job, you usually have to do the stuff other people don't want to do. You kind of the crummy jobs that nobody else wants. They're like one of the things we normally did in our military unit tactically was put the new guy on point. And when stacking up on a door to secure a room or something, the point man was the first man in, and he was also the most likely to become a casualty, unfortunately for him. The one with the most authority was often in the middle of the stack. And there's a leadership advantage there, but it's also the least likely spot to become a casualty. It's the safest spot. The highest authority in heaven, though, chooses a posture of a servant on earth. He steps in first. He loves us first. And if anyone ever had the right, the authority, and the strength to be served, it is Jesus. Jesus could have imposed his power and authority and set himself above everyone and forced people to submit to him. It'd be easy for him to do that. And that's basically what the disciples want Jesus to do. And frankly, that's kind of what a lot of Christians still want Jesus to do. And it's part of what Satan tempted Jesus to do. But that's not what he came to do. Our passage says he came not to be served, but to serve. Service is not beneath Jesus, it defines him. His service is what makes him great. Jesus shows us the ultimate definition of greatness, authority, and servanthood. Our passage says he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' service is not symbolic or self serving, it is substitutionary on our behalf. He stepped into the place on the cross where we should be. He gave his life as a ransom. When someone's held for ransom, that means someone wants to be paid to set him free. And Jesus gave his life as a ransom for many. And that means he gave his life as the price for freedom from sin for us. Jesus isn't just nice to people. He doesn't just help people. He's not just what would you say? People like to call him a good teacher. I mean, he's all those things, but he's so much more. He used his power and authority and his life to serve us by doing for us what we can do for ourselves. He used his strength to do what we can't. He was our substitute on the cross. He shed his blood in our place. He took our punishment upon himself so that we might be redeemed. He purchased our freedom as slaves to sin at the price of his own blood and his own life. We don't have the power to do that. We can't do that. We can't be good enough to do that. And that's why we look to Jesus and place our faith in him as Christians. He used his power and authority to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And that's how authority is exercised in his kingdom. And if you're struggling with trying to liberate yourself from sin, constantly struggling with sin, or trying to work your way to God, trying to be good enough for God, stop it. Stop it. I was listening to a favorite pastor of mine, Alistair Begg, the other day, and he said, if you stand at the gates of heaven, there's that old classic evangelism question we like to ask about, if you stood before God and he asked you, why should I allow you into my heaven? If your answer begins with anything in the first person, it's wrong. It's all about Jesus. Turn to Jesus. He's already done for you what you can't do for yourself. Turn to him and accept him. Put your faith in him to do that for you because it's already been done. Authority in God's kingdom is not extracting value from others, it's laying down your life for others. Authority grows in that sacrifice. Greatness flows from service. Leadership is built on love that is willing to bleed. And I think people tend to conflate the idea of servanthood with submission. And they're different things. And authority doesn't exist without servanthood. Those two go hand in hand. And submission is misunderstood because people see it as forced, which is not the case. They don't understand the difference between biblical and worldly submission or oppression. And I'll show you what I mean. If I say, the Bible says, wives, submit to your husbands, you can feel the tension rise. And I've spoke on that a few times in the past. And that tension is the result of different things. Sometimes it may be abuse, it may be a misunderstanding of what it is. 90% of the time, it's just simply pride. And all of those stem from a worldly point of view in which submission is conflated with oppression. And oppression is opposed, whereas submission is granted. Um, like in Judea, the Roman Empire oppressed Judea, whereas they forced themselves on the people, where submission is granted. Submission is a choice you make. Submission is accepting or yielding to the will or strength of another person, oftentimes to do something you can't do yourself. It means to give way. It means to allow them to do it. And biblically, that's beneficial. Like we submit to Jesus. And authority grows from sacrifice. The definition of biblical servanthood is the use of strength in the service of others under God's direction. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Now, if someone sacrifices themselves for you, uses their strength to serve you, and loves you to the point of being willing to bleed for you or even die for you, the decisions they make are for your benefit. And that's where they operate from. Would you choose to make way for that person to do that? That's biblical submission and biblical authority. Now, biblical authority is strength used for the good growth and protection of others under God's direction. Authority is not seized, it's not forced. If it is, it's not biblical authority, it's authoritarianism or oppression. Authority is not seized, it's something that is received, it's something people allow you to have. No one possesses it inherently. And of course, in secular authority, we have positional authority. People are elected positions, whatever. But even Jesus says authority was given to him by the Father. Biblical authority exists for the good of someone else, and the person who is the recipient of the good submits, allowing that to happen. Servanthood and authority are not in opposition to each other at all. Servanthood is the posture of authority. biblical authority is serving those under your authority. Authority is a responsibility given to serve others. One without the other is incomplete. Together, they form leaders who are both gentle and dangerous in the right way. Like the guy in the picture with the wolves and the sheep. He's dangerous to the wolves, but he's helpful to the sheep. Very dangerous. And that applies in church and families. Men, don't be harmless. Be gentle and dangerous. Dangerous is not a bad word or a bad thing. Um, a harmless shepherd is worse than useless when wolves show up. Um, and I'm not simply talking about physical strength, but being as strong as you can be at all things, most of all in your relationship with the Lord. And it's not, no, I heard someone say, what was it? It was like when you come up in a place and you're in authority and you up to a situation that someone is panicky or angry or trying to attack you or whatever, you are in a position where you say, I'm not afraid of you and I'm not your enemy either. I think that's a good example. So it's not simply physical strength, but being as strong as you can be at all things, most of all in your relationship with the Lord, and using that strength to serve others, whether it be your family, your church, or whatever, in particular men. But what God holds in tension, people can't resolve. And that all sounds good, the things we've talked about, but where's the tension? And, there is tension between authority and servanthood and doing both of those things well. And the tension is the same place as always is. It's inside us. But God doesn't resolve the tension. So we have to learn to be comfortable in it. There's always going to be tension in us between those two things, wherever we serve, whatever we do. God grants real authority, and his authority is not a joke, but he also demands that we empty ourselves. We often, especially in church leadership, I think we either tend to soften authority so that no one is offended, or we harden it to the point that no one could question it. But that's because people do that because they can't learn to live in the tension. So they tip to one side or the other to avoid the attention. They soften authority so as not to offend anyone and have to deal with any tension, or we harden it so no one can question it. Again, so we don't have to deal with any tension. But God doesn't allow us to do that. In the middle lies the tension, the place between the two. And biblical authority calls for genuine obedience, not just symbolic agreement. People want authority that works and servanthood that feels nice, but God gives authority that costs and servanthood that leads. And the tension in the middle is heavy. And it's something that if you are going to lead well as a Christian in whatever scenario you might be in, of course, my mind goes immediately to being a pastor because that's where I am. But if you're going to lead well, you have to get comfortable with the tension in the middle between authority and servanthood. And we always want to go one way or the other because the tension is often difficult to deal with. But authority and servanthood go hand in hand, whether we're in a position of leadership or serving to make things happen. It's almost like God gives us two levers. There's one lever for authority and one for servanthood, but it takes both hands to completely pull one lever. If you put both hands on the authority lever and pull it, though, it becomes authoritarianism. If you put both hands on the servanthood lever and pull it, it becomes appeasement. But God says, I want you to keep one hand on each lever and keep them both under tension. Keep pulling and keep pulling. And that tension, that's the tension. And he holds that tension, and we're not able to resolve that. We have to live in the middle. It, each week, towards the end of our time together, I always give you a few examples of ways that you can apply what we've talked about through go, live, and grow, or grow, live, go. And that's part of our purpose here at Hinterland is grow, live, and go. And this week for grow, reject false choice between being strong or being kind. That's kind of what we were just talking about. Put a hand on both levers. Refuse leadership that dominates and refuse service that avoids responsibility or appeasement. Step into your God given role with courage, restraint, and clarity. Step into the tension. Don't panic. Just learn to be comfortable in it. It's kind of like sitting in the sauna. After about 10, 15 minutes, you start to think, boy, this is getting to be a lot. But you learn to be comfortable in there. And the more you practice it, the longer you can stay in there. And then live. Like, live with one hand on authority and one hand on servanthood. Use your strength to protect, guide, and order what God has entrusted to you, uh, your family, your work, your church, whatever it might be, without using it for yourself. And that can be a real challenge at times. And then go or grow. Grow by becoming both gentle and dangerous in the right way. Strengthen your walk with Christ through prayer and obedience. So authority is anchored in obedience, and your service is shaped by love that's willing to bleed. Well, that's all we've got for this week. I hope you've found that helpful. And if you do, you know someone who might make good use of it, please share it with them. The more we can get God's word out there in the world to different people, the more people hear it, the better off we'll be. Look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking, faithful, grounded, and free.